Happy Friday! Welcome back to Drinking by My Shelf. We are drinking water by my shelf today because it's important to stay hydrated. My name is Emma and this is Balancing the Books, which is the game I play every month where I add up all of the books that came onto my TBR, all of the books that came off my TBR, and I try and make those numbers balance. At the beginning of September I started with 45 books on my TBR, and the first thing I did was actually a reread, so it didn't help reducing the books from my TBR at all. You may have seen these books because they have been all over TikTok, all over Instagram because they're beautiful. The Before the Coffee Gets Cold series. The first book, Before the Coffee Gets Cold, is one of my favourite books. I read it a couple of years ago. It made me weep. I then had reread it in time for the sequel to come out, so I didn't read this one again this month because I know this one, it's in my heart, but I do massively recommend. But I did reread the sequel, Tales from the Cafe, in time to read Before Your Memory Fades. So in terms of what all of that actually means for my scales, this book didn't do anything because I had already read it. It wasn't on my TBR. This book I hauled and then read. So the scales are still even. Essentially this series is about a time traveling cafe. That's not right. The cafe doesn't time travel. It's about a cafe that you can visit and travel in time. And there's all of these like quirky little rules. So you have to sit in a particular seat. The seat is usually occupied by a ghost. You have to wait for the ghost to leave. The coffee has to be poured by a particular family, a member of this particular family. You can go back in time, but then you will still be in that seat back in time. So if you want to meet someone, it has to be someone who visited the cafe because you can't go anywhere, and you only have a very short window of time because you have to come back to the present before your coffee gets cold. I can tell you way more about this series. I actually made a video for Book Break, the channel that I run for work, all about this series and all of the different characters that you meet in each one. So I will link to that below. I went and travelled around London and I tried different Japanese cafes and talked about the books. I had a great time, so I recommend you go watch that video. They are very emotional books because they're really about like wistfulness and longing, and one of the rules of the time travel is that nothing you do will change anything in the present. So you can't bring someone back from the dead. You can't, if you're broken up from a relationship that you're missing, you can go back in time and talk to your partner, but it won't mean that you're not broken up in present day. So you can't change anything. It's more about going back and coming to terms with things that have happened. So it's about acceptance. So the stories do really make me weep. I would say that the first book in the series is still very much my favourite. This was a 5-star read, best of the best. It was always going to be hard for the next books to have quite such a big effect on me and to really recapture that magic, but once you love this world, like I'm just gonna keep reading these. I could read 100 stories set in this world. The third book, Before Your Memory Fades, the most recent one, it's actually set at a new cafe, but it has the same characters and it's got some really good callbacks to the first book. They're also very unusual in the writing style. So they're translated from Japanese, so obviously I don't know how much of it is the original author's writing, how much of it is the translation, but they're almost like stilted, and I don't mean that as a criticism. The dialogue in this book is almost quite unnatural, but I think that it lends it this kind of otherworldly feel. I think that none of the characters in these books quite act like you think people will, and somehow that's part of the fun. I wonder if that's why they've been so popular, is that kind of strangeness to it. Then I hauled 2 books. So these were given to me by one of my colleagues. She was doing a clear out of books, and we tend to have very, very similar reading tastes. Like almost every single book we've both read, we agree on, so we give each other a lot of book recommendations. Funny enough, these ones weren't exactly like, they weren't glowing recommendations from her. So this is When She Was Bad, which just, you know, looks like a pretty standard thriller, and The Newlyweds, which is about a woman who meets a man online and then comes to America from Bangladesh to marry him, and it's about this kind of very modern union. And both of these were books that my colleague read and then like didn't love them enough to keep them. She was getting rid of them, but she also thought that both of them were books I would have fun with and that she wanted to talk to me about them. I think this one she said was pretty bad, but that she wanted me to have read it. So, you know, they're maybe not like super high on my TBR priorities, but I will read them at some point and talk to her. Then I hauled Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes, and I read Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes, and I loved this book. This is the third book that I've read by Natalie Haynes, and it's my favourite so far. This retells the story of Medusa, but the story that I always grew up with was Medusa was this like terrifying monster, snakes for hair, and she is part of Perseus's story. So Perseus is sent on a mission to defeat her in order to save his mother from a marriage to a wicked man, and so she's just like one of the obstacles in his story. That's always what I grew up learning. But in this book, Natalie Haynes has looked back at the original myths and how Medusa actually has her own story, her own backstory, and she was transformed into this Gorgon who, so she has snakes for hair, and looking at her will turn you to stone and you die. So she's terrifying. But that was a curse that was put on her by Athena as punishment, very unfairly, because Medusa was raped by Poseidon in Athena's temple. And Athena was so outraged at this thing having happened in her temple that she punished Medusa for it. Like, fucking Athena, what are you doing? Anyway, so this book retells the whole story, and it's really fun. If you've read 1,000 Ships, this is kind of similar, and it's told from loads of different voices. You jump around, you meet loads of different characters, particularly female characters, and slowly piece together how all of these different strands of the story are going to come together and be relevant to Medusa's story. It's a lot of fun. Again, I made a whole video on this book for work, so I'll link to that below as well. And the best part of all of this, which I have not shut up about, is in the office we had a little party to celebrate the publication of this book, and there was a Greek mythology quiz, and I finished this book on my lunch break that day, so it was all fresh in my mind, and so I won the quiz. And you will see that I mentioned that 3 times in that video I made for work. I also sent a whole company email, and I put it in there as well. I won the quiz. I went to the book launch. I went up to Natalie Haynes. I said, Natalie, I won the quiz. I was so proud of myself. I won the quiz. Also, this book is really funny. That's something important I want to mention about it. It's often very sad. It's very powerful. But it's also really, really funny. Natalie Haynes has a great sense of humour, and she gives the different characters very distinct voices, and a lot of them are very snarky, particularly about Perseus, who was the hero of the stories that I grew up with, but actually is presented in this book as a complete dweeb, doesn't know what he's doing, and also as the book goes on becomes like pretty evil. I mean, he's just he's not a good guy, not a good guy in any way. And the way that some of the other characters talk about him is very, very funny. Then I read Hare House. I did a vlog where I read 4 different dark books, so I'll link to that vlog below. The first one I read was Hare House by Sally Hinchcliffe. This is a sort of modern gothic story about a mysterious woman, unnamed narrator, who moves to Scotland, moving away from this mysterious past that she has. We know she used to work in a school and that something strange happened. Like the very first scene that we read is this flash of her standing in the classroom and all of the girls in her classroom dropping to the ground. And we don't know what that means, we don't know what happened, but we know that she has had to leave because of this past. And so she comes to Scotland and she lives in this little cottage that's on the grounds of a big massive house called Hare House, which is owned by our main character's landlord. And he lives there with his younger sister, who is very troubled. And it's very chilling. I found it very chilling. It's one of those books where you're never quite sure, are things actually supernatural or not? There's a lot of talk about witchcraft, there's a lot of rumours in the village, and it just kind of gets really tense. It's set in winter, and at one point there is such strong snowfall that the characters can't leave, and so they're getting like more and more claustrophobic. I didn't quite understand the ending. I was really enjoying this book. I thought the ending slightly let it down because I didn't really know what it meant, and there were also a lot of questions. I don't mind questions left unanswered, but in this case I'd say it felt more like threads that just got forgotten, like things just got dropped. So I was slightly disappointed by the ending, but I think overall the book is about women who are perceived as witches, basically. That's the message that's coming through in here. It's about women who live in any way differently from what is expected of them and how they are perceived as witches. But then the book also has this hint that there may actually be real witchcraft going on. So it's fun. I read Into the Dark by Fiona Cummins, which was, it was honestly a fairly forgettable thriller for me. It was fun, it was page turning while I was reading it. I do like Fiona Cummins' writing. I think she's got a wicked side and I really enjoy that. But compared to other books from Fiona Cummins that I've read and really, really enjoyed, this one it's not one that's gonna have stuck with me. I've already kind of forgotten what it's about. A family go missing. A whole family suddenly vanishes. The best friend of the mum comes around in the morning and no one is there, but the breakfast is all kind of on the table. It's still warm, their phones are plugged in, so it looks like they literally just vanished into thin air, and there is some blood on the light on the ceiling. So they know something terrible has happened. And you jump around a lot in time, which is quite fun, flashing back all the time, learning more about what happened in the build up to this, what's happening afterwards. The investigation is being run by Detective Saul Anguish, who is actually a character who was in one of Fiona Cummins' earlier books. He was a teenager in that book, and he got involved with a serial killer who was dark, a morally grey character, and now he's grown up and he's this detective, and he's still a creepy character. So that was quite fun having him in there. But for some reason the book just didn't grip me as much as her other books have. I found that when I wasn't reading it, I wasn't like thinking about it. I wasn't forming theories. I wasn't desperate to know what happened next. But when I was reading it, it was fun, and it was, you know, it was entertaining. It was turning the pages. I haven't given you any star ratings so far. These books, I would say the series as a whole is a 5, but it's really the first book that's a 5-star for me, and then the second one's probably 4, the third one's maybe 3, maybe 4. Stoneblind was a 4 that maybe could have been a 5. I think this is a book that'll be in my favourite books of the year. Hare House was a 4. Into the Dark was a 3. Okay, we're up to date. Next, I hauled a book called Katherine Called Birdie by Cushman, and I read it. And again, I have a video dedicated to that. I will link below to a vlog that I did for work where I read this book all in one afternoon, and it was a really fun time. The reason I read it is because there is a new movie coming out, or out now, that's directed by Lena Dunham, and it stars Joe Alwyn in it, and Billie Piper, and the hot priest from Fleabag, various people, so I think it's gonna be like a fairly big movie. This is a fun feminist children's book. It's actually from the 90s. I'd never heard of it before, which is surprising. I feel like this is the kind of book that I would expect lots of people to say was their favourite book as a child. It's a kind of Ella Enchanted type of book, though nothing can beat Ella Enchanted for me. And actually, on the vlog that I made for work, someone commented on it saying how much better this book was than Ella Enchanted, and it made me want to cry. However, I did really like this book. It's set in medieval times, and it's about a girl called Katherine, nicknamed Birdie, or Little Bird, who is 13 years old, and her parents are already trying to marry her off, as was the norm in this time. And it's about how much she does not want to get married. She's this really like feisty character, she's very funny. And this book really did surprise me. It's very different from any other similar book that I might have read, in that it's very empowering without having to have the happy ending that you might expect. So essentially the author is saying this was the historical reality, and you know, you can then take from that, even today there are people all over the world in situations out of their control, and basically this book is about learning that your situation does not define you. So I was kind of expecting going into this that I'd get this happy ending where the girl like runs away and she can have her own life and do what she wants, and actually it's a different kind of happy ending. I'm very interested to see what the movie does, if it keeps it the same or if it changes something for a film audience from one audience. I don't know, but I think this was really special. I gave it 3 stars in terms of like my reading experience at my age today. I would rate it more highly as a book, you know, for the target audience. Then I read The Men by Sandra Newman. I really enjoyed the majority of this book. The book starts with this unexplained event where all of the world's men just vanish without a trace. It happens at the exact same time all over the world. Suddenly the men are gone, and the men in this is defined as people with Y chromosomes. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. There has been conversation around this book about whether or not it is transphobic. The way that the book handles it is acknowledging that trans women have also been vanished in this, and trans men remain. Like I said, I'll talk more about that in a second, but essentially it's about this phenomenon where half of the world has vanished and we follow a few of the people left behind. So there's a few different characters that we follow their perspectives. There's one main character called Jane, and actually what's interesting is that nothing particularly, from the majority of the book, nothing particularly happens in Jane's story. She spends 10 days at the beginning searching for her husband and son, and we don't actually follow any of that. We just hear that that's what she did. And then she spends the majority of the rest of the book on this road trip, just traveling across the country trying to find her ex-girlfriend, and along the way she is reminiscing about her past, and so we learn about this very, very dark past that she has, and it's drip fed to you, so you know that there is something that's happened in her past. She's worried about the women that she meets, that they might recognize her because she's one of the most hated women in America, so you know that from early on. You slowly find out what happened. And her story is really dark and really sad. There is also then a website called The Men, which is showing video clips of the people who are vanished, and people start recognizing their friends and family and loved ones in these video clips, and the video clips are really strange. So they show the vanished people in this kind of post-apocalyptic wasteland with creepy like animals that we don't have on Earth, and they're not acting normally. Their mouths are moving, but they're not saying any words. They're just kind of these like zombie figures, and then they start to get violent, and it starts to get like, pretty horrific. And then there is the ending, which was so disappointing to me, because I was loving this book. I was absolutely hooked. It's so haunting and compelling and terrifying. I was just, I could not tear my eyes from the page. I thought this is gonna be a 5-star read. This is gonna be one of my favorite books of the year. And then the ending happened, and it's so abrupt and strange, and it's like, I'm not going to say what happens, but it's an ending that people joke about being like a shit type of ending to do, and it happens in this book, and I don't understand why it was there. So that was a big letdown. I did still give this book 4 stars because the majority of the reading experience for me was incredible. Really, really enjoyed this book. So, criticism of this book. The concept, before the book even came out, when the concept was known, people did criticize it and say that that concept could be transphobic, and so I did pick up that book kind of wondering about that. While I was reading it, I didn't think that it was transphobic, but since finishing reading it, I have then read some reviews written by trans people who did find it transphobic and have found their opinion, you know, there's things that of course I hadn't picked up on, so reading other people's opinions, I can see why this book is problematic in that way. It was explored in here, the arbitrariness of the fact that the vanished people were vanished along the lines of chromosomes. That's how it was defined. And the author herself has said that she doesn't believe in gender essentialism at all, and in the book they kind of say, there's one character who says that it's proof that there is no God. The arbitrariness of this, it seems like a kind of like an alien intervention. So I didn't feel like the author was trying to make a point about biological essentialism. However, she didn't do a lot of exploration. So it was touched upon, and I thought there were interesting conversations in there. And also the fact that there's this website called The Men, and people talk about the men having vanished, and then characters do have debates about that not being the right wording, because there are men left on Earth, there are trans men left on Earth, and there are trans women who have vanished. So it's in there, but I think it could have been explored more, especially because what's interesting is that actually it's not gender that's the big theme in this book, it's actually race. I thought this book was a lot about the dangers that white women pose to the world, to society. I thought that was what was being explored more in here, but I would have liked to have seen the gender discussion in there as well. So it's very complicated, and it's really interesting, and I do want to keep reading more about it. But when I say that I loved this book, it actually isn't, while it's got this really high concept of all the men vanishing, that isn't what drove the book for me. I was more interested in, I think Sandra Newman has an incredible writing style. It's very dreamlike. I've read one of her books before, The Heavens, and I found it then as well. Her writing is really enchanting to me. So that's why I loved the book. I was fascinated and appalled learning about Jane's history. I was really interested in the exploration of white guilt and the dangers of white feminism. I found that really interesting. It is written by a white woman, so again, there may be critiques to be had of the way that she poses it, but I appreciated having that topic brought up and explored a bit. So yeah, complicated opinions on this book. The final book that I read in September was How to Kill Your Family by Bella Mackie, which was really, really fun. This is another 4-star read. A lot of 4-star books this month. It was a good month. This book is about a young woman called Grace who is setting out on a mission to kill her entire family, her entire extended family, as punishment for the fact that she was rejected by them, basically. So she was born, her mother had had an affair with this very rich, successful man and had got pregnant, and then this man had wanted nothing to do with her. So Grace had grown up with her mother, and she loved her mother. After her mother died, she said, I'm getting revenge. I'm gonna kill off every single member of that family that rejected me. And so you watch her picking them off one by one. I found this book so much fun. She is such a wonderfully horrid character. She hates so many things. She hates so many people, and so many of the things that she's really critical of are me. So she said she hates people who live in Battersea and willingly work in marketing and drink Jaeger bombs and wear bobble hats, and oh my god, she would murder me. If she met me, she would murder me. But I loved her like wicked voice. This is now the third time that I've said this about a book this month, but I didn't like the ending. The ending kind of ruined it for me. Keep reading really good books with not great endings. I do think that actually it is kind of the best way this book could have ended. It's just not what I wanted. And I didn't like, I'm not going to give any spoilers, I didn't like the way that it was delivered. There are things I would have changed about that. I liked what happened, I liked the outcome, I didn't like the way the information was given to us, but I wouldn't let that take anything away from the recommendation. It's a really, really fun book. It's very, very entertaining. We read this one for my book club, and we had a lot of fun talking about our favourite characters, least favourite characters. There were more in that category of like just terrible people to hate in this book. One of my friends said that she didn't like the book, but then her reasoning was there wasn't enough murder in it, so I think maybe she's the problem, because there was a lot of murder in this book. So yeah, really recommend. Great way to finish my reading month. So I'm not quite finished. It's finally a last minute addition to my TBR, Early Morning Rising by Katherine Heiny. Heiny? Raf read this book this month and she absolutely adored it, so I'm going to read it next. I think this is one of those books that's just kind of following characters through the years of their lives and a lot of the ordinariness of life along the way. Raf loved it for the writing mostly, I think, more than it being like plot driven. It's about the characters. I know there are some sad things that happen to these characters along the way, but I think it's kind of witty and funny sad. So I'm excited. I'm going to read this one next. So that means that I have successfully balanced the books, and in fact the scales are tipped in my favour. I have now only got 44 books on my TBR. We will get through them all in the end. So don't forget to subscribe to this channel because I post new videos every Friday, and I'll see you next time.